The sky above Brier Hollow turned the color of a bruised peach 3 days before the storm arrived, and no one in the valley looked up. No one, except a 17-year-old girl behind the cabin at the north end of the road. She had been splitting wood since sunrise. Her hands were red, her breath came out white. But when that color spread across the western ridge, that sick yellow-gray, spreading like ink, dropped into still water, she set the hatchet down, and she stood very still. She remembered what an old cattleman had told her when she was 12 years old. He had pointed west without warning and said, "When the sky goes that color, girl, you get inside, and you stay inside." Her name was Adaline Thorncroft. She had lost her mother and father when she was 10. She had lived 7 years in a house where no one had ever spoken her name with love. In 3 days, the worst blizzard Wyoming had seen in more than 30 years would come down out of those mountains. But the storm was not the thing that would try to kill her that week. Her own uncle was. He had already paid 3 men 5 silver pieces to make sure she did not survive the night he sent her out and what she would find. Buried beneath a hillside no one had ever mapped, would change every winter that came after. This is her story. Adaline Thorncroft was 17 years old. She was behind the cabin at the north end of Widow's Ridge Road, splitting wood since the sun came up. Her hands were red, her breath came out in white clouds, and her back ached in the specific way it always ached on Tuesdays. Because Tuesday was the day the woodpile got refilled. Because her uncle Elias had decided 7 years ago that Tuesday was that day. And her uncle Elias did not change his mind about things. She was mid-swing when she felt it. Not saw it, felt it. A shift in the air, something behind her, on the western ridge. Something the light was doing that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She lowered the hatchet slowly. She turned, and she stood very still. The color was spreading across the sky above the Owl Creek Range. That specific shade, that sick yellow-gray, moving in every direction at once, without appearing to move at all, like ink dropped into still water. Dead sky, that was what the old-timers called it. She had heard the phrase exactly once. She had been 12 years old, a stranger, a grizzled cattleman on a bay horse. He had pulled up alongside the road where she was walking. He had pointed west without preamble. "When the sky goes that color, girl, you get inside, and you stay inside." Then he had ridden on. She had never forgotten the way he said it. She stood there in the snow, watched the color deepen. Her breath slowed. Her mind did not. 3 days, maybe 4. That was how long she had. Behind her inside the cabin, she could hear Elias moving. The heavy drag of his boots across the floorboards. The clank of his tin cup against the stovetop. The particular rhythm of a man who had never learned to move through a space as though other people might be sleeping, or thinking, or trying to survive. She picked up the hatchet. She kept splitting, because there were worse things than a storm coming. She had understood that since she was 10 years old, and the understanding had only sharpened in the 7 years since. Brier Hollow was the kind of place that people did not choose. They arrived. They ran out of money. They ran out of road. They ran out of the particular kind of hope that required a destination. And then they stayed, because staying was easier than leaving again. The valley sat in a long, shallow bowl between 2 ridges of the Owl Creek Range. The town proper was almost nothing: a general store, a livery, a church that doubled as a schoolroom 3 days a week. A loose scatter of houses along a dirt track someone had once optimistically named Widow's Ridge Road. Beyond that, homesteads. Each one a different family's version of a future the land had not yet confirmed, or denied. Most of them were losing. The Thorncroft property sat at the far north end, closer to the tree line than to any neighbor, which suited Elias Thorncroft precisely, because proximity to other human beings had never once suited him. He was not a cruel man in any dramatic sense. He did not raise his voice. He did not raise his hand. He was something more specific than cruel. I was a man who had arranged the world into columns of usefulness, and he had assigned Adaline to one of those columns at the age of 10, when she had arrived at his door. Raw, grieving, the particular terror of a child who had watched both parents lowered into ground that was supposed to be temporary. Her father and mother had been moving from eastern Nebraska, chasing a land claim her father had read about in a pamphlet. What they found instead was a summer that burned everything it touched, and then a fever. In late August, the fever came up the river and refused to negotiate. Adaline had survived, because she was strong, because she was young, because survival, she had come to understand, operates on a logic entirely its own. Elias Thorncroft was her father's older brother. He had taken her in without warmth, without complaint. He fed her. He kept a roof above her head. And in return, she cooked. She mended. She kept the animals alive through seasons that made a regular practice of trying to kill them. 7 years of measuring her own worth by what she could produce before the day ended. She did not hate him. Hatred required sustained attention. She had learned not to waste it on things she could not change. What she had done instead, in the margins of those 7 years, was learn. She read everything within reach. The agricultural almanac, a worn medical reference someone had abandoned at the general store. 2 geography books discovered in the church lending box. A collection of letters written by a surveyor working the Colorado high country. She read about soil composition. She read about bone setting. She read about the behavior of weather systems moving east off the mountains. She read because reading was the one thing Elias had no use for, and therefore the one thing that was entirely hers. She also watched. Water running after rain, frost patterns on window glass that told you exactly how cold the previous night had been. Cattle turning their backs to the western wind 2 full days before a storm arrived. Horses standing unusually still in the hours before weather changed. Barn cats disappearing into the hay pile in a way different from their usual disappearing. Information lived everywhere if you were willing to receive it without deciding in advance what shape it should take. The week before the storm, Brier Hollow had been busy. Farmers loading extra grain onto wagons. Women buying lamp oil in larger quantities. The livery owner reinforcing his doors with a second crossbar. Elias had done nothing. This was not laziness. It was a refusal to be alarmed by things that had not yet arrived. He had made it through 17 winters in this valley, he had told her once, and not one of them had killed him. Adaline had not pointed out that 3 of those same winters had killed other people. She had spent the previous 2 weeks preparing. On her own, not dramatically. She did not have the resources for drama. She had moved the extra blankets from the cedar chest to the shelf above her narrow bed. She had checked the oil level in her mother's brass lantern, the small one, the one she had carried all the way from Nebraska, wrapped inside a folded shirt. She had refilled it from the can in the storage shed, and she had packed a canvas bag, 2 dresses, a wool blanket, half a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, the brass lantern already filled, a small folding knife her father had pressed into her hand the summer before he died. She remembered his hands, warm, steady, the knife pressed into her palm. A knife is not a weapon, Ada. It is a tool, and every person ought to have one good one. She had added things one at a time, over several weeks, tucking the bag behind the flour barrel in the corner of the kitchen. The one place Elias never looked. She told herself it was prudence. She was not preparing for anything specific. She was, of course. She had simply not let herself name it. That afternoon, 3 days after she first saw the dead sky, Adaline was inside the cabin. Cleaning. Elias had gone to the general store. He would be gone perhaps 2 hours. She had a routine on the days he went to town. She wiped down the stove. She swept the hearth. She washed the tin plates. And then, if there was time, she looked. Not for anything specific, just looked. That day, she was dusting the top of his bureau. The wood was warped. One of the drawers stuck. She pulled it. It resisted. She pulled harder. Something inside shifted. The drawer came open. Papers. She was going to close it. She was. She had learned over 7 years exactly how not to trigger her uncle's attention. Except that on top of the papers, right on top, was an envelope with her mother's handwriting on it, her mother. She had not seen her mother's handwriting in 7 years. Her breath caught. She lifted the envelope, the particular care of a person handling something that might not be real. The envelope was addressed to Mr. Elias Thorncroft, Brier Hollow, Wyoming Territory. The postmark was smudged, but she could make out the date, October 1873. Her mother had died in August of 1873, which meant her father had mailed this, right before he died. Adaline's hands were shaking. She opened it. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a letter, in her father's handwriting, short, businesslike. Brother, if you are reading this, then Sarah and I are gone. Our daughter Adaline is your responsibility now. Enclosed are the deed papers to the 40 acres I purchased in the North Valley 2 years ago. It belongs to Adaline. It is her inheritance. Per my written instruction, you shall transfer the title into her name on the day she turns 17. Do this thing properly, Elias. She is all we have left. Adaline could not breathe. The second document was the deed, 40 acres, registered in the territory of Wyoming, in the name of Adaline Rose Thorncroft, minor, held in trust, to transfer at age 17 per grantor's written direction. She sat down on the edge of Elias's bed. 7 years. 7 years he had known. 7 years he had kept it in a drawer. 7 years he had let her sleep in the corner near the stove and eat leftover salt pork and split wood on Tuesdays and believe she owned nothing. She had turned 17 3 months ago. She read the letter again, her father's handwriting. She is all we have left. Something moved through her chest, not rage. Rage was too loud. This was quieter, colder, something more like understanding. She sat there for a long time. Then she folded the papers carefully. She put the envelope back in the drawer, exactly where she had found it, except she took one thing. A sheet of paper from the writing box on top of the bureau. She copied the deed information, every word, every date, every signature, onto her own paper, in her own handwriting. She folded the copy small. She tucked it into the seam of her wool coat, the inside pocket she had sewn herself, the one Elias did not know about. She put everything back exactly as it had been. She closed the drawer. She went back to sweeping the hearth. When Elias came home an hour later, she had supper on the stove. He did not look at her. She did not look at him. But something in her had changed, and she would not unchange it again. That evening was the evening that turned out to be her last inside the cabin. Elias was quiet through supper, in a way that was distinct from his usual quiet. His usual quiet was the absence of interest. This quiet had weight, the kind of weight you felt at the edge of a table, the way you felt weather coming before you could see it. He ate without looking at his food. His jaw moved in the deliberate way of a man chewing on something that had nothing to do with the plate in front of him. Adaline ate her own supper. She said nothing. She had made salt pork and potatoes, the same meal she made 3 times a week, because it was what they had. The candle between them shortened by about an inch. Then he set his spoon down. He did not look at her when he spoke. He looked at the middle of the table, as though the words were addressed to the air, rather than to any particular person. "You're 17 now." A pause, not quite long enough to invite a response. "Old enough to make your own way." Adaline set her own spoon down. She kept her hands flat on the table, because she knew if she let them move, they would shake, and she was not going to give him that. She said, quietly, "What are you saying, Uncle Elias?" It was not really a question. They both understood that. He picked up his spoon again. He looked at his plate. "Winter's coming hard this year. I can't feed 2 on what I put up. You'll do better finding your own situation." He said it the way a man states a weather fact. Something external. Something unfortunate. Adaline looked at him for a long moment. There were things she could have said. She could have told him she had put up more than half of that food herself. She could have told him she knew about the deed. She could have told him what he was really doing tonight. She said none of it, because she understood, with sudden, clear, terrible certainty, that none of it would matter. Elias Thorncroft was not a man whose conscience could be reached by accurate information. He had already arranged the story inside his head into a shape he could live with. She rose from the table. She carried her plate to the wash basin. She heard him push back from the table. She heard his footsteps cross the floor. She heard the door to his room close. The bolt slid home, a soft, final sound, not dramatic, just done. Adaline stood at the wash basin with her hands in cold water for a moment. Then she dried them on the cloth by the basin. She went to the kitchen corner. She lifted the canvas bag from behind the flour barrel. She put on her coat, the heavy wool one that had belonged to her mother, let out at the seams twice as Adaline had grown into it. She pulled her boots on. She laced them tight. She picked up the brass lantern from the shelf where she had positioned it 2 weeks ago. Already filled, already ready. She stood at the front door for a moment, not hesitating, deciding. She thought about the copy of the deed sewn into her coat, right over her ribs. She thought about the dead sky. Then she opened the door and she stepped out into the first thin snow of what would become the worst blizzard Wyoming had seen in more than 30 years. The cold arrived against her face like a flat hand, firm. Not the killing cold yet, just the announcement of it. The snow was light, more like frozen mist than real snowfall, drifting sideways through the dark. The temperature was somewhere below 15 degrees. She knew this from the way her nostrils felt when she breathed in. Her father had taught her when she was 8 years old. When it bites there, Ada, you dress in layers. You keep your face covered. Below zero feels different. You'll know it when it comes. She started walking. Before she finished, her first thought about where to go. Walking was better than standing. Standing gave fear a place to root. The road north out of the valley was the only one that made sense. Foxglove Junction lay 14 miles to the northeast. Small, but real. It had a church, a boarding house, the possibility of work. 14 miles was walkable, even in snow. If the snow stayed light and the temperature held, it did not hold. She made it 4 miles before the wind changed. It came from the northwest, with a decisiveness that removed any remaining uncertainty. Not a gust, a shift, a sustained new direction that pushed directly against her left side. The snow changed character within minutes. Heavier, driven sideways now, sticking to her eyelashes. The road ahead became a suggestion rather than a certainty. She kept walking, because the alternative was to stop. And stopping in this kind of wind was the first step toward a kind of stillness that had nothing peaceful in it. The trapper's shack appeared out of the dark about a half-mile off the main road, visible only because of the orange crack of firelight showing beneath the door. Adaline left the road without thinking twice. She could feel her fingers well enough to know they were not in danger yet, but the direction they were moving in was not favorable. She knocked. The door opened almost immediately, which meant someone had heard her coming. 3 men inside, one fire, small but real. The smell of wood smoke, damp wool, old sweat. The man nearest the door looked at her, somewhere in his 40s, a beard that needed attention. Behind him, 2 younger men sitting close to the fire. No room. The words came out before she had said anything at all, which told her this had already been discussed. I'm not asking for much, just until morning. I'll stay by the door. I won't take fire space. She meant it. She had spent years becoming expert at taking up very little space. The older man looked at her. Something in his face shifted, not quite pity, closer to guilt. He shook his head once. He stepped back. The door began to close, and that was when she heard it. Through the closing gap, through the wind, through the crackle of the fire, one of the younger men behind him, voice low, but not low enough. That's her, isn't it? Thorncroft's niece. The older man, sharp. Shut up. He said 5 silver if she doesn't make it back by morning. The door closed. Adaline stood in the snow for 3 full seconds. She did not move. Her mind did not spiral. It did the opposite. It went perfectly, terrifyingly, clear. 5 silver. Her uncle had paid 3 men to make sure she did not survive the night. Not to hurt her directly. He would never do it directly. He had simply arranged that she would be turned away. Everywhere. Until the cold did the work he did not have the courage to do himself. She thought about the deed, sewn into her coat. She thought about her father's letter. She is all we have left. She thought about 7 years of eating salt pork by a stove she had fed herself. She turned. She walked away from the shack. She did not run. Running would have used breath she needed. She walked, steady, away from the road. Because they knew she would take the road. She went east, off the road entirely, into scrub pine. She walked for 2 hours. The conditions worsened incrementally, the way the most dangerous situations always do. Each step slightly harder than the last, until she found herself somewhere well past where turning back would have been sensible. At some point she left the last of the ruts entirely. She stopped. She turned in a slow circle. The lantern cast a pale yellow sphere around her, maybe 6 feet in diameter, beyond which the snow closed in gray and absolute. The trees were unfamiliar. The slope beneath her feet ran in a direction she did not trust. Her internal compass felt uncertain in a way that frightened her more than the cold did. She made herself breathe. In a controlled way, her father's voice. Reliable. Don't spiral, Ada. Work the problem. What do you know? She ran through it. She knew she was north of Elias's property. She knew she had gone mostly northeast. She knew she had come downhill. She knew the wind was still coming from the northwest, which meant if she kept it on her left cheek, she was heading generally east. She started walking east, or what she hoped was east. 20 minutes later, she stepped through a break in the trees, onto a rocky slope that dropped steeply to her left. She caught herself on a tree trunk before she slid. She pressed her back against it. The cold in her hands had moved past discomfort, into that particular deadness that was not quite pain. She tucked them inside her coat. against her ribs, the lantern hanging from her elbow. The wind had dropped slightly, or she was sheltered by the rock face to her left. The relative quiet was clarifying. She stood still for the first time in hours, and she noticed something. The ground beneath her right boot was warmer than the ground beneath her left. Not dramatically, but standing still, with both feet planted on the rocky slope, there was an unmistakable differential, a faint, persistent warmth rising through the frozen soil, localized to an area roughly the size of a dinner plate, as though something, several feet below, was gently exhaling upward. Adaline crouched. She took her right hand out of her coat. She pressed her palm flat against the snow. Through the inches of accumulated cold, she could feel it. Not warmth exactly, but the absence of the deep freeze that characterized everything else around her. Something, below, was generating heat. She moved her hand in a slow arc. She traced the warmth to a crack in the rock face at the base of the slope, a thin trickle of warm air, ghost of vapor rising and dissolving in the lantern light. She started digging with her hands, at the snow banked against the rock, and what she found was a pipe, iron, narrow, crusted with rust, but intact, angled upward through the stone at a deliberate angle, not natural, made. Someone had run a pipe through solid rock, from the inside. She stepped back. She looked at the face of the hill, and then she saw the door, set so deep into the hillside that it read as landscape. A dark rectangle framed in rough-hewn timber, pressed back under an overhang of frozen roots and compacted soil. Nearly invisible, heavy, old but maintained, the wood dark with oil and age, but not rotting, the iron hinges solid rather than flaking. Someone had cleared the entrance recently. The snow immediately in front of the door was shallower than what surrounded it, the edges of the clearing precise rather than wind-shaped. Adaline stood very still. The locking beam that should have been seated across the door from the outside was leaning against the wall beside the entrance. The door was not locked. She lifted her hand. She knocked. The sound of her knuckles against the heavy wood was startling in the stillness. She waited. Nothing. She knocked again, harder. No sound from inside, no footsteps, no voice. Adaline looked at the open air to her left. The temperature was still dropping. Her fingers had been numb for better than an hour. She looked at the door. She pushed it open. The warmth came out of the underground chamber. The way warmth comes out of a house that has been heated for a long time. A sustained, enveloping quality. Adaline stood in the doorway for a moment, just breathing it in. She stepped inside. She pulled the door closed behind her. The chamber was lit by oil lanterns mounted at intervals along timber-reinforced walls, each one trimmed to a low, steady flame that cast warm amber light across everything. Adaline looked at the shelves for a long moment, canning jars packed tight, peaches, beans, tomatoes, potatoes in open crates sorted by size. Dried herbs hung in bundles from a low crossbeam, barrels sealed with wax cloth, flour in cloth sacks, salt in a ceramic crock, oats in a slatted bin. Not a winter's worth of food, significantly more. The kind of abundance that required deliberate planning across multiple seasons. The chamber was longer than she had expected, 25 feet at least, perhaps more. A cast iron stove squatted near the center of the room, its firebox glowing orange through the vent grill. A kettle sat on the stove surface, not resting cold, set there by someone who had planned to return to it. Adaline held her right hand near the stove. From 2 feet away, she felt the heat reach her palm. She moved closer, and she stayed there. And the sensation as her fingers began returning to use was a slow, insistent ache. That confirmed something she had not let herself examine, that she had come very close to not finding this place. A wooden table occupied the wall to the left of the stove. Tools she could identify, a coil of wire, books stacked with their spines aligned, a folded piece of paper. The chair at the table was pushed back at an angle that suggested someone had risen from it recently. She called out, "Hello." Her voice sounded muffled by the earth around her, absorbed rather than echoed. Nothing answered. "Hello, is anyone here?" Silence. The floor near the entrance to the corridor caught her attention. Boot prints, recent, snow still visible in the impressions, melted but not fully absorbed. Someone had come in, within the last hour. Adaline picked up the iron poker from the rack beside the stove, not because she was planning to use it, because it was the sensible thing to have in her hand. She stood in the center of the main chamber, and she listened. The stove crackled softly. Somewhere deeper in the earth, something shifted. Then another sound, a footstep, followed by another, coming from the corridor. She adjusted her grip on the poker. She turned toward the passage. He came into the lamplight the way a large man moves in a low space. Tall, broad through the shoulder, even with heavy winter layers added over whatever he wore beneath, gray hair showing at the temples. Under a dark wool hat, a face that had spent considerable time in outdoor weather. The kind of face where the lines were structural rather than decorative, carved by decisions and conditions, rather than time alone. One hand held a rifle, not raised, not pointed, held along his side, the way you carry a tool you are not currently using. The other hand gripped a length of wire, and 3 rabbits, their feet bound together. He stopped in the threshold, and he looked at her. His eyes moved from her face to the poker in her hand, to the canvas bag on the floor, to the door she had come through, then back to her face. This entire inventory took perhaps 4 seconds, and was conducted without any change in his expression. Adaline did not lower the poker. Neither of them spoke. The stove crackled. Outside, the wind pressed against the hill above them. The man looked at the door again, at the storm on the other side of it. Then he looked back at her, and when he did, his gaze moved to her boots, the snow and ice packed into the seams where sole met upper. Then to her coat, where the frost along the collar told its own story about how long she had been outside. Then back to her face, which she kept as neutral as she could manage, while her heart did complicated things behind her ribs. He exhaled once, slowly, through his nose. He set the rabbits down on the floor. He leaned the rifle against the corridor wall, with a deliberate care that made the choice visible. The gun going to the wall, rather than coming toward her. Both of his hands moved away from his sides, slightly, palms out, an old gesture, meaning what it always meant. You picked one hell of a night to get lost. His voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that had learned not to waste volume on anything that did not require it. Adeline's grip on the poker did not change. She stayed quiet. He looked at the poker in her hand. If I meant you harm. A pause. I wouldn't knock the snow off my boots before I came in. She looked at his boots. There was a pile of snow just inside the corridor entrance, where he had stamped his feet. She looked back at him. Slowly, she lowered the poker. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Then he crouched by the rabbits. He began to untie the wire around their feet, without looking at her. There's cider in the jar on the second shelf, left side. Adaline did not move. He glanced up briefly. You've been outside how long? 4 hours, maybe 5. He nodded, data that fit a calculation he had already been running. Warm your hands slowly, against your own ribs first. 10 minutes. Then the stove. Faster than that, and you'll damage the tissue. She stared at him. He looked up. You know that already. It was not really a question. She had read it. In the medical reference 3 years ago, she nodded once. He almost smiled. Almost. Then he went back to the rabbits. And Adaline, 17 years old, standing in a warm underground chamber, in the middle of the worst storm the valley had seen in more than 30 years. Holding an iron poker she no longer needed, understood something, for the first time in 7 years. That the worst thing that had ever been done to her had also, without anyone's intention, brought her exactly here. She did not know yet what here would mean, but she was warm. Her fingers were coming back. Somewhere outside, 8 days of storm were only just beginning, and inside this hill, a man she did not know was cooking rabbit over a fire the wind above could not reach, and neither of them had yet spoken the words. That would change what this place was for. The first morning and inside the hill arrived without announcement. No change in light, no gradual brightening at a window, no bird song to mark the threshold between night and day. Adaline woke to the same amber glow of the trimmed lanterns, the same steady breath of the stove, and for a disoriented moment, could not locate herself, in time or geography. Then the weight of the previous night settled back into her body, all at once. The way full understanding always arrives after sleep, not gently, but completely, like a door opening onto a room you had forgotten existed. She lay on the narrow cot the man had pointed her toward without ceremony. Sometime past midnight, still in her coat, and listened to the sound the hill made when the storm pressed against it from above. Not the shriek of wind through gaps, not the groan of wood under lateral force, just a low, sustained pressure. The earth itself holding something at a distance that the something could not cross. She got up before he appeared from wherever he slept. The stove had burned down to coals. She fed it, without thinking, the way she had fed Elias's stove for 7 years. Though this one was a different instrument entirely. The cast iron was thicker, the draw more controlled, the whole mechanism designed to produce sustained heat from less fuel, rather than spectacular heat from more. She found the technique by feel, adjusting the damper in small increments. Until the fire caught and climbed evenly, she put the kettle on. When he came through from the back corridor, he stopped. He looked at the stove. He looked at the kettle. He looked at her. He said nothing. But something in his posture shifted, almost imperceptibly. A fractional easing. The kind that happens when a person has been bracing for something and then discovers he does not have to brace anymore. His name was Mordecai Vale. She learned this gradually, not from an introduction, since he did not offer one, and she did not ask, not at first, but from the way he moved through the space and spoke about it. The chamber had the quality of a person who understood it as precisely his own. Each object placed with specific intention, each system connected to every other. He set the rabbits on the work table and began to skin them, with the economy of someone who had performed the action enough times that it no longer required thought. The lantern light caught the blade in small flashes. After a while, without looking up, "How long were you out in it?" 4 hours, maybe 5. He glanced at her hands, which she was still holding toward the stove, fingers coming back slowly. He nodded. He went to the shelf. He took down a jar without looking. He poured something into a tin cup. He set it on the stove surface. Cider, not hot yet. Then he returned to the rabbits. Adaline watched him work. He had the stillness of someone accustomed to his own company. Not lonely, she thought, but solitary, in the way that was a chosen condition, rather than an imposed one. He did not fill the silence with unnecessary talk. He did not ask how she had ended up outside in a blizzard, or where she had come from, or who she belonged to. He skinned the rabbits, and she stood by the stove, and the storm pressed against the hill above them. And for a while, that was simply the state of things, eventually. Checking the cider. "You can sit, there's a stool on the other side of the stove." She found it, she sat, and the simple act of sitting, the first time in hours, sent a wave of exhaustion through her so complete that she had to press both hands flat on her knees for a moment to stay upright. She breathed through it. He glanced over once, then looked away, giving her the privacy of it. "You built this?" Not a question. He did not look up. "Started 12 years ago." A pause. "Not finished." "Why underground?" He set the prepared rabbits aside. He wiped his hands on a cloth. He took his time answering, because he did not see the point of a quick answer, when an accurate one required longer. Cabins fight winter. He looked up at the ceiling, at the curve of earth and timber, and 12 feet of hill above them. They stand up against it. Wind, snow, cold. A cabin pushes back against all of it, and winter pushes harder. He looked at her. "This place doesn't fight it. The hill doesn't care what the sky does." Adaline looked up at the same ceiling. She looked back at him. "You built it alone." Something moved across his face, not quite expressible in the available vocabulary of his expression. One wall at a time. He turned back to the work table. She picked up the tin cup. The cider had warmed to something that did not quite burn. She drank. She asked him about the ventilation, not making conversation. She genuinely needed to understand the pipes she had found in the snow outside, how many there were, how they were routed, what happened if one became blocked. Mordecai sat down across the table. He answered with the seriousness of a man who respected the question. 3 pipes total. 2 ran through stone channels, natural fissures in the granite that he had widened over several seasons, routing the exhaust laterally through the hillside before turning upward. The third was the emergency vent, shorter, more direct, sealable from inside if needed. The system was designed so that no single blockage was catastrophic. He had spent 2 winters getting it wrong before he got it right. Adaline listened, then asked to see the junction points. He looked at her for a moment, then stood and showed her. They spent an hour moving through the shelter's connected chambers. The sleeping chamber with its packed earth walls in single cot. The storage room where the wood pile was stacked bark side down. The secondary supply room, where provisions were arranged in a rotation she recognized as sophisticated. Before he explained it, older stock at the front, newer behind, nothing touching the floor directly. Near the back of the wood storage, she found it. A loose pipe fitting, a small separation at a junction, where the iron flange met the clay lining of the wall channel, not leaking yet, but flexed slightly from the temperature differential. In 6 weeks, perhaps 2 months, it would open further. She asked if he had wire and a pair of pliers. He pointed to the tool rack. Without comment, she spent 20 minutes at the fitting, wrapping and crimping, in a technique she had read about in the context of mine ventilation. When she finished, the junction was tight in a way it demonstrably had not been before. Mordecai had watched from the doorway of the storage room. When she came out, he went in, examined the repair. Without touching it, he came back out. He went to the shelf where the coffee tin lived. He poured a cup. He handed it to her. "Where did you learn that?" "Books, mostly." She wrapped both hands around the cup, then paying attention to how things actually behave. He drank his own coffee and did not say anything else. And she had the sense. She had passed some threshold, without fanfare, recognized only in the quality of the silence that followed. That night, after the stove had been banked down, after she had listened to the storm above them settle into its second organized phase, Mordecai brought out a jar. He set it on the table between them. He poured a small amount of clear liquid into 2 tin cups. He pushed one toward her. For the throat, not the head. One swallow. She looked at it. She had never had spirits in her life. She took the cup. She took one swallow. It burned the whole way down. But afterward, her chest was warm in a way that spread outward. Slowly, Mordecai drank his own. He looked at the lantern. Then he said, very quietly, "My wife's name was Constance." Adaline did not move. She understood, without being told, that this was not a story he was choosing to tell. It was a story that had chosen to come out. Her job was to hold still and listen. "She died 12 years ago." His voice was level, but the levelness was doing work. "She was 6 months along with our first child." Adaline closed her eyes briefly. She opened them again. "We had bought 40 acres on the south side of this ridge, legally. Deed filed in Cheyenne. Water rights clean." He turned the cup in his hands. "There is a man in this valley named Beauregard Ashcroft." The name meant nothing to her. She waited. "He owns most of the land south of the road. He wanted our 40 acres because there was a spring on them. He offered to buy us out. We said no. He offered more. We said no." A pause. "Then he sent men in the night with torches. They burned the cabin we had built with our hands while we were inside it." Adaline felt the cup grow cold in her hands. "We got out, both of us. Constance was burned on her arm. Not badly, not the burn." He stopped. "It was November. We had nowhere to go. No one in the valley would take us in because Beauregard Ashcroft had told them not to. And Beauregard Ashcroft had the ear of every man who owed money to anyone." His voice did not change, but something in his hands did. "We walked, trying to reach Foxglove Junction. She was 6 months pregnant. The cold was bad that year, not like this, but bad." He was quiet for a long time. "She died 3 miles from the junction, in a stand of pine. She was too cold to walk further. I built a fire. It was not enough." He looked up. His eyes were dry, but the dryness was terrible. "I sat with her until morning. Then I walked into Foxglove Junction, and I told them my wife had died in the storm. And no one asked how a healthy young woman with a husband beside her had died in a storm, because they all knew, and none of them wanted to say." He drank the last of his cup. He set it down. "I started building this the following spring. I told myself I was building it so I would never freeze again. That was a lie. I was building it so no woman would ever again die in these hills, because there was no roof over her head." Adaline could not speak. She did not try. She reached across the table. She put her hand, very briefly, on the back of his. He did not move, but he did not pull away. After a moment, she lifted her hand. They sat there, while the storm above ran its second night. The knock came in the early evening of the second day. Not tentative, not polite. The double-fisted knock of someone who had used the last of their available energy to reach a door. Adaline was on her feet before Mordecai, which surprised her, and she thought, surprised him slightly as well. She looked at him across the stove. He nodded once. She opened the door. Ren Callahan came through it. The way a man comes through a door when his legs have stopped being fully under his control. Forward momentum still carrying him, while the machinery that generated it was shutting down. Adaline caught his arm before he went to his knees. He was built the way farm work built men, somewhere in his early 30s. But right now he had the specific weight of someone whose core temperature had been negotiating downward for hours and losing. His lips carried a grayish undertone. That concerned her more than the shaking did, because shaking meant the body was still fighting. She got him to the floor near the stove. Mordecai was already moving, the cot from the sleeping chamber, blankets from the cedar trunk, the kettle repositioned to the hottest part of the stove's surface. They worked without discussing it, each reading what the other was doing and filling the gaps. The coordination surprised her, because it was the first time she had worked alongside anyone who operated that way. Wren's hands were the first concern. She pulled his gloves off, stiff as boards, ice in the seams. She examined his fingers under the lantern. Frostbite, early stage. Outer 2 fingers of his right hand, skin pale and waxy, but not blistered. Sensation still present, though muted. She filled a basin with water, warm, not hot. She held his hands in the basin. She kept her fingers on his wrist, tracking the pulse. Wren's eyes had been half closed since he came through the door. Now they opened fully and found her face. "I know where I am." His voice was rough at the edges. "Mordecai Vale's place. I've heard of it." He looked around at the visible extent of the underground chamber. Didn't imagine this. Mordecai was at the table behind her, setting water to boil. He did not respond to being named. But Wren looked back at Adaline. "Who are you, Adaline Thorncroft?" Something moved in Wren's expression, a flicker of something she could not read yet. "Elias Thorncroft's place, north end of the valley." "I know Elias Thorncroft." He said it without elaboration, and the absence of elaboration was its own kind of statement. The water in the basin had cooled to match his skin temperature. She swapped it for warmer, working methodically. "Your stove went out." She said it without looking up. Wren almost smiled. "Chimney packed with ice from the inside. I didn't catch it until the cabin had already dropped below what I could bring back with kindling alone." A pause. "I had to go. It was that or sit in it." Mordecai set a tin of broth on the stove to heat. He said nothing, but he was cooking, which communicated everything it needed to. They came because Wren had marked his way, before he had left his farmstead, in the particular state of focus that arrives when fear clarifies rather than paralyzes. He had driven wooden stakes into the snow, at measured intervals, from his property north toward the tree line, in the direction he had heard Mordecai Vale lived. He had not known the exact location. He had made a direction and committed to it. The families who came after him followed his stakes until the stakes ran out, then found their way the last distance, on instinct. The ground above the vent pipes perceptibly warmer than the surrounding snowfield. The faint vapor rising from the iron pipe, visible to someone who was looking for anything at all. The Boone family arrived first. Hattie, her son Micah, 4 years old, her husband was already dead, had died 2 winters ago in an accident with a horse. Hattie was the kind of woman whose face held its composure. As a deliberate act, the composure of someone who understood that if she came apart, her son would reorganize around that collapse. She stepped into the chamber. She looked at the shelves and the stove, and Adaline standing beside it. Something in her face shifted briefly, into a relief so profound it looked like grief. Then she pulled it back, and she asked what she could do to help. Adaline gave her the task of organizing the bedding, sorting what existed in the storage room, making an inventory of what they had versus what the growing number of people would need. Hattie Boone went to work immediately. Then came Bart Coulter, alone, on the end of the 3rd day. Howe was large, somewhere in his 50s, with the particular solidity of a man who had spent decades doing heavy work, and the particular stubbornness of one who had spent those same decades never doing it for anyone else. He looked at the crowded chamber. He looked at Mordecai pointedly, not looking at Adaline, and said he had lost a wall, not a window, not a section of roof, a wall. The north-facing wall of his cabin had given way, under the accumulated weight of the drift packed against it, and the interior temperature was now equivalent to the exterior. He was given a space near the back of the main chamber. He sat in it, with his arms across his chest, and his expression arranged into something between dignity and fortification. And Adaline left him alone. Pastor Ephraim Whitlock arrived at dusk, on the 4th day, his overcoat frozen stiff, his fingers wrapped around a leather-bound Bible he had refused to leave behind. He looked at the chamber. He looked at Mordecai. He looked at Adaline, and he said very quietly, "I have been walking 6 hours, and I would like to sit down." Mordecai brought him a chair. Adaline brought him broth. He drank it slowly. He looked at the ceiling. He said, "To no one in particular. There are places God builds, and there are places men build, and sometimes, very rarely, there are places where the two agree with each other." He looked at Mordecai. "This is one of them." Mordecai looked at the stove. He said nothing, but he did not disagree. By the fourth day, the chamber held 17 people, and the arithmetic Adaline had built in her head on the second morning was under its first real pressure. She had been tracking the stove's wood consumption since Wren arrived, comparing it against the pile in the storage room. The numbers were coherent, but 17 people breathed and ate in the food stores. Even with her rationing, we're moving in a direction that required attention. She laid it out at the table that evening, Mordecai on one side, Wren on the other, not as a crisis, as information, current population, 17. Estimated storm duration, based on Mordecai's experience of this range, another 4 to 6 days minimum. The margin was positive, but not large. Mordecai listened, without interrupting. Wren made a small sound partway through that she recognized as someone doing the same arithmetic independently. When she finished, the table was quiet. "There's more coming," Wren said it. I marked trail for anyone who could follow it. Word moves fast when people are scared." Adaline nodded. "Then we tighten the portions, starting tomorrow morning." She looked at Mordecai. He looked at the table surface for a moment, then nodded. The announcement went less smoothly than the decision. Most people accepted it, with the particular dignity of men and women who had been through hard seasons before. Hattie Boone had already halved her own portions, without being asked. The pastor bowed his head and thanked God for the food they had. Bart Coulter pushed back, not aggressively, not quite, but with the pressure of a man accustomed to being one of the larger forces in any given room. He looked at Mordecai when he spoke. "I don't know who put the girl in charge of the food." He said it with a studied reasonableness, more corrosive than anger would have been. "But I'd want to know the thinking." The room went very quiet. Mordecai was at the stove, with his back to the table, and he stayed there. He did not turn around. He took a portion of stew from the pot, a portion visibly smaller than what he had eaten the previous day. He sat down with it, and he began to eat. He said nothing. After a moment, Bart Coulter looked at his own plate, and he ate. Adaline stood very still in the space that followed and made sure her face did not do anything she would regret. What she felt was not triumph. It was the particular sensation of having been defended, without words, which was a form of defense she had never previously experienced and did not quite know how to hold. The only authority worth anything, she understood in that moment, is the kind that does not need to announce itself. That night, she noticed Micah. She had been keeping a general eye on all the children in the group, because children were poor at reporting symptoms and skilled at hiding discomfort from adults whose stress they could sense. She found Micah in the late morning, sitting very still, in a way that 4-year-olds did not usually sit, the stillness of a child whose body was managing a problem and requiring quiet to do it. She made note. She watched through the afternoon. By evening, when the lanterns were trimmed low, she crouched beside him. She asked to see his hands. Hattie was immediately awake, from whatever light doze she had achieved. Micah held his hands out, without protest. The outer 2 fingers of his left hand were swollen, the skin caught between white and a deep red that had not resolved into either. Slightly waxy at the tips, past the earliest stage, but not yet into the territory she most feared. She was not a doctor. There was no doctor. The window was still open. Calmly, asking Hattie for a cloth, asking Mordecai for warm water, asking Wren to hold the lantern at an angle that gave her better light. She worked without rushing. The water was the right temperature. She tested it against the thin skin of her inner wrist, the way the medical reference had specified. She held Micah's small hand in the basin. She kept her other fingers on his wrist, tracking. Micah did not cry. He looked at her with the complete attention of a small child, deciding whether to trust, and she met that look and held it, and he decided. It took 2 hours. At the end of them, the color in his fingers had moved from the wrong end of the spectrum towards something closer to normal. She wrapped them in a strip of clean cloth, cut from the hem of a spare dress. She told Hattie what to watch for through the night, and what it would mean if she saw it, and what to do. Hattie repeated it back, twice, to make sure she had it correctly. After the two of them were settled, Adaline sat by the stove, with her knees pulled up and her back against the warm iron, and let her hands shake, now that no one was watching them. Mordecai set a cup beside her on the floor, without comment. Wren sat down nearby, not crowding her. He waited until she had drunk half the cup. Mrs. Boone is going to tell that story for the rest of her life. His voice was low enough not to carry. Adaline looked at the cup. I just paid attention to the right things. Most people don't. He watched the stove for a moment. I grew up with 4 younger siblings. A pause. I know what it looks like when someone is actually watching instead of just being in the room. She did not respond, but she filed it somewhere. From that night forward, she made a single pass through the chamber each morning, checking each person briefly, asking about hands and feet, noting any unusual stillness. Mordecai watched her do this the first morning, without comment. By the third morning, she found the medicine supplies she needed moved to a shelf at arm level, near the stove, the one she had previously had to search for, now positioned for easy access. He had done it at some point while she was sleeping. He never mentioned it. Silas Puett had arrived on the third day, in the middle of a group of 4 others, unremarkable in the flow of arrivals, quiet, in the way some men were quiet in groups, not shy, but conserving, watching. Adaline noticed him, filed him, and moved on. He sat apart from the main group, ate what he was given, caused no trouble, which was itself interesting, because a man who caused no trouble at all, in a room full of frightened strangers, was usually a man who was thinking about something else entirely. On the 5th night, she was awake past midnight. She lay on the cot, listening to the breathing of the people around her. Then she heard footsteps that were not someone waking for a necessary reason. Deliberate movement, careful, with the specific quality of someone trying to be quiet in a way that went beyond ordinary courtesy. She tracked the sound through her eyelashes. The lantern on the far wall had been turned to its lowest functional setting. The figure moving in its edge light was visible as shape rather than detail, moving not toward the accessible shelf where daily provisions were kept, but toward the secondary storage door. She was on her feet. She moved to the back of the chamber. She lit a lantern from the stove's embers. She turned it up, and when the light spread across the room, Silas Puett was standing at the storage door, with his hand on the latch. He turned, he looked at her, his face held no particular surprise. There's nothing in there that changes tomorrow morning's portion. Quiet, level, not accusatory. I counted this morning. The count doesn't change by looking at it again. Silas Puett looked at her for a long moment, then he looked at the door. Then he walked back to his spot on the floor and lay down. She waited until his breathing had evened out before she moved the key from its current location to a different one. Then she lay back down herself and thought about how long 8 days could be. The next morning, something else happened. She was checking his coat, which he had left on his sleeping spot, folded. When she went to add wood to his corner's small brazier, she did not mean to look inside it, except that a folded paper fell out. She picked it up, meaning to put it back, except that the paper unfolded partially as she caught it, and she saw the handwriting, her uncle's handwriting. She would have known that handwriting anywhere. The paper said, Puett, once you have located the shelter and confirmed its position, return with sketched approach. Ashcroft wants the boundary lines by first thaw. Second half of your payment on delivery. The signature at the bottom. E. Thorncroft. Adaline read it twice. Then a third time. Silas Puett had not come to the shelter for warmth. He had come to find it. He had come to find her because her uncle and Beauregard Ashcroft were working together to take this hill, the hill on which she now stood, the hill that had, 12 years ago, been Constance Vale's spring. Adaline stood very still. She folded the paper, exactly as she had found it. She put it back in the coat pocket. She said nothing to anyone, not yet. But she watched Silas Puett for the rest of that day, and she understood that the storm outside was not the only storm she was in. Then came the 6th day, and Mordecai knew, before anyone else did. She could tell by the way he went still in the middle of sharpening a blade. He lifted his head. He read something in the air that she had not caught yet. Then she caught it. The stove drawing slightly differently. The fire making a subtly altered sound. The atmospheric pressure in the chamber shifting in a way that registered as a change in her ears, before she understood its source. She looked at Mordecai. He set the blade down. The primary vent. He said it, very quiet. She understood immediately. The exterior exit of the main exhaust pipe, now packed with ice. The fire was still burning, but the exhaust had nowhere efficient to go. The headache that arrived at the base of her skull within the next hour was not from tension. She recognized it from something she had read about badly ventilated mine tunnels. The specific physiology of carbon monoxide exposure. The fact that the process was gradual. Easy to miss, until gradual became something else entirely. She told Mordecai in a low voice what she was reading in her own symptoms. His jaw tightened. He told her where the exterior exit of the primary vent was. 15 steps from the door, due west, marked with an iron stake she would never find in this visibility without specific guidance. They both understood what needed to happen. He began to explain how he would go out. She stopped him. You built this place, knowing which jobs were yours. She held his gaze. This one isn't. He looked at her steadily. You don't know what it's like out there right now. I was out there 6 days ago. She did not look away. I know exactly what it's like out there. Something moved across his face through several stages quickly. Then he got the rope. He spent 30 minutes showing her the knot, a double anchor wrap, 2 fixed points rather than one. He showed her the clearing tool, a length of stiff wire with a widened end. He explained the angle she would need to approach the exit pipe from, to clear the ice without driving it deeper. He gave her the cloth for her face. He double-checked the wrap himself, which she allowed, because it mattered more that it was right than that she had done it herself. He tied the rope around her waist. He looked at her once, without speaking. There was no word in his particular vocabulary for what he was looking, so he did not try to find one. Adaline turned and opened the door. The cold outside arrived, not as a gradual condition, but as an immediate physical fact. A total replacement of the warm air she had been breathing for 6 days, with something that had no interest in her survival. The wind drove sideways across the slope, with a force that was not gusting, but constant, and the snow it carried was not falling, but migrating, a horizontal movement of frozen mass that had given up any relationship with gravity. She could not see past her own extended arm. She moved by counting. 1 step, 2, the rope paying out behind her. Somewhere back at the door, Mordecai held the other end. She could feel this through the line as a specific tension, different from the drag of rope across snow. She counted to 15. She felt for the iron stake with her boot. She found it at 17 steps, slightly off the direction she had expected. The wind had been pushing her without her feeling it. She found the pipe exit with her hands, not her eyes. She drove the clearing tool in. At the angle Mordecai had specified, she felt the ice give, then give again, then the rush of warm exhaust against her glove. That meant the passage was open. She turned around. She could not tell which direction she was facing. The rope was there. She pulled it taut and walked it back. 11 minutes, by the count she kept in her head. She came through the door. Mordecai pulled it shut behind her, and the quiet descended again, absolute, pressurized, with the relief of 20 people who had understood enough of what they had been watching to understand what it meant that she had come back. Hattie Boone's hand on her shoulder. Brief, firm, Micah watching from across the room, with his wrapped fingers. Wren across the chamber, who looked at her with something she did not have a word for yet, then looked away quickly. Bart Colder said nothing, but the next morning, when she began the daily rounds, and reached his corner of the chamber, he held his hands out for inspection, without waiting to be asked. That night, Mordecai made tea. He brought her a cup. He sat down across from her, at the work table. The first time he had sat across from her there, rather than at his usual angle, the lamp between them lit the cup from below. He looked at it, not at her, when he spoke. My wife would have done exactly what you did tonight. He stopped. It was clearly not something he had planned to say. He turned the cup in both hands. I'm not saying that to compare you to her. I'm saying it because it's the highest thing I know how to say. Adaline looked at the table between them. She did not speak for a long moment. She said only, very softly, thank you, Mordecai. The name was the first time she had spoken it out loud. He heard her hear him. He nodded once. He did not look up. Outside, the storm ran its 6th night, with no particular interest in what was happening in the hill below it. Inside, the stove burned at a controlled rate. The vent pipes moved warm exhaust outward through the stone, and 20 people breathed. in a space built by one man's grief, and maintained now by a collection of people who had nowhere else to be. Adaline sat at the table and drank her tea and listened to the storm and understood that she was no longer waiting for it to end. She was inside something that had already changed the shape of what came after. She thought about the folded paper in Silas Putt's coat pocket. She thought about her uncle's handwriting. She thought about Beauregard Ashcroft, the name Mordecai had spoken 2 nights ago, the name in the letter. The same name. The two men who wanted this hill were the same two men, and she understood that when the storm finally broke, the real one was going to arrive. She looked across the table at Mordecai. She did not tell him, not tonight, because he had told her about Constance only 2 nights ago, and she would not put another weight on him tonight. She would tell him tomorrow, or the day after. When the wind quieted, she finished her tea. She stood up. She went to her cot, and for the first time in 7 years, she fell asleep in a place where somebody in the next room knew her name and did not think it was worth less than the food on the shelf. The silence arrived, the way truth sometimes does, not as an event, as an absence. The gradual subtraction of something so constant that its removal felt like a new kind of pressure. Adaline woke on the 8th morning and lay still for a full minute before she understood what was different. The storm had stopped pressing. The hill above them was simply a hill again, not a surface under siege, and the quiet it held was the deep, padded quiet of new snow on top of old snow, on top of a landscape that had been rearranged. While no one was watching, she was at the stove before anyone else stirred. She stood, with her hand on the iron surface, and listened to the quality of the silence, and felt something move through her chest that she did not try to name. The fire needed feeding. She fed it. The kettle needed filling. She filled it. The ordinary work of a morning was the same work it had always been, and she did it, because it was there to do. Mordecai appeared from the back corridor, with the specific alertness of a man whose body had registered the change before his mind caught up to it. He stood in the corridor entrance for a moment, head slightly tilted, reading the air. Then he looked at Adaline, and she looked at him, and he went to the door. It took both of them to move it. The snow had compacted against the outer face during the night, a consolidated wall of settled white. That had decided the door was a convenient surface to lean against. They pushed together, Mordecai with his shoulder, Adaline with both palms flat, and the door gave in increments. Until it gave, all at once. Morning light came in and hit everything. Adaline stepped out first. Her boots broke through the top crust with a sound like something releasing. The world outside was enormous, every landmark she had known, reduced to suggestions. Beneath a surface so uniform and bright, it registered as almost abstract. The valley below was a painting of a valley. White fields where grain stubble had been. White rooftops where there had been rooftops. White roads where there had been roads. But the smoke was there, rising from 6 points across the valley floor. Thin columns climbing straight in the windless morning air. Each one the specific gray of a fire that had been maintained, rather than newly started. She stood in the snow, and she counted them, and she felt something loosen in her. That had been holding tight for 8 days. Mordecai stood beside her. He looked at the valley below, in silence. He had lived on this hill for 12 years, and had stood outside this door through 4 winters. She understood from the quality of his stillness that he was seeing it differently now than he had before. They made it. She said it, not a question. Most of them. He said it honestly. He did not know, and did not pretend to. Most was what the smoke told them. Most was what they had. The departures began before noon. Wren wanted to get back to assess the cabin damage, before the snow softened, and made movement harder. His practical urgency set a rhythm for the others. People gathered their things with a careful specificity, returning borrowed objects with precision, saying their various goodbyes in the ways their particular natures allowed. Hattie Boone held Adaline's hands in both of hers, for a moment, before she released them. Micah Boone, 4 years old, his left finger still wrapped in the cloth strip cut from his mother's dress, pressed those wrapped fingers briefly against Adaline's coat sleeve, in a gesture too deliberate to be accidental, and too small to require a response. She put her hand over his wrapped ones, briefly, and that was enough. Bart Coulter left without ceremony. At the door, he paused, his back to the room, his hand on the frame, and then half-turned, not enough to meet anyone's eyes. Good thing someone was paying attention. Then he was gone, down the slope, his boots punching through the crust in a straight line that did not waver. Adaline understood that from Bart Coulter. In this context, that sentence carried the full weight of an apology. She accepted it without making him acknowledge he had given it. Pastor Whitlock was last of the strangers to leave. He stood at the threshold, his Bible in his hand, his overcoat still stiff with residue of the storm he had walked through to get here. He looked at Mordecai. "You have built a righteous thing, sir." Mordecai did not answer, which answer enough. The pastor turned to Adaline. He placed his hand very lightly on the crown of her head, the way a man blesses a child at the church door, without ceremony and without doubt. "The Lord sent this storm, and he sent you into it. Do not forget the second part. When you are trying to make sense of the first, then he was gone too." And Silas Pwitt, she had almost forgotten him. In the middle of the leaving, almost, he came to the door, wrapped in his coat, his pack over his shoulder. He did not look at her on his way out, which was fine, because she looked at him. She looked at him all the way to the door, and when he was one step from the threshold, she said, quietly, so that only he heard, "Tell Beauregard Ashcroft I know his name." Silas Pwitt went very still. He did not turn around. He did not answer. He stepped out into the snow, and he walked down the slope, and Adaline watched him until the tree line took him, and felt not the satisfaction of a resolved problem, but the more complicated feeling of a problem that was about to resolve itself, whether she was ready or not. By early afternoon, the chamber held 3 people. Mordecai at the work table, with the trap he had been maintaining in pieces for 2 days, reassembling it now with the focused attention of someone returning to interrupted work. Wren by the stove, nominally warming himself before the walk back to his farmstead, actually sitting in the particular way of someone who had decided he was not quite ready to leave, and was building reasons to stay. Adaline moving along the shelves, doing an accurate count of what remained. The result of the count was better than she had projected on the 4th day. The margin Mordecai had built into the stores had been substantially consumed, but not broken. The logic of it remained intact, with resupply possible now that the storm had passed. She wrote the numbers in the margin of a piece of paper from the work table, using the pencil stub from the tin where Mordecai kept small tools, and set it where he would see it. Wren watched her do this. He had been watching her do things for 8 days, with the accumulated attention of a man slowly revising a set of assumptions he had not realized he was carrying. "You're not going back." He said it as an observation, rather than a question. Adaline set the pencil down. Outside the door, the valley glittered with the indifferent beauty of a landscape that had just finished doing something tremendous, and felt no particular way about it. "No," she said, "I'm not." That evening she made a decision. She sat down at the work table across from Mordecai. She said, "There's something I need to tell you." He set down the trap piece he was working on. He waited. She reached into the inside pocket of her wool coat, the one she had sewn herself. She took out the copy of the deed that she had made the afternoon she found it in his drawer. She unfolded it on the work table. Mordecai read it, slowly, without touching it. Then he read it again. When he looked up, his face had changed, not in an obvious way, nothing dramatic, just the specific stillness that came into it when he was processing information that mattered. "This is your inheritance." "Yes." "He hid it from you." 7 years. Mordecai looked at the paper again. 40 acres, North Valley. He looked up. "That's the parcel that adjoins this ridge, on the east side." She had suspected. She had not been sure. "Yes." Mordecai was quiet for a long moment. Then she took out the second thing, the folded paper, from Silas Pwitt's coat pocket. She had lifted it on the morning of the 7th day, before he left, because she had realized he would need it to claim the second half of his payment, and she would need it to prove what she was about to prove. She unfolded it next to the deed. Mordecai read it. His face did not change, except in the eyes, where something ancient and very tired sat up. "Ashcroft," he said the name, very quietly. "Yes." "Your uncle and Ashcroft, together." "Yes." Mordecai leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then he looked at her. "You've known since when?" "Since the 5th night the paper fell out of his coat when I was adding wood to his brazier. And you did not tell me. Not while there were 17 strangers in this chamber, and a blizzard on the roof, and a man who did not need one more thing to carry that night." Mordecai looked at the table. Something in his throat moved. "Once," he said, without looking at her. Thank you. She said nothing because it was not the kind of thank you that needed a response. 3 days later, Wren came at a run. Adaline was outside, behind the shelter, checking the snow depth over the primary vent exit, making sure the recent thaw had not caused new obstruction as ice reformed at night. She heard him, before she saw him, the specific sound of a man moving faster than the terrain wanted him to move. She came around the side of the hill. Wren stopped when he saw her, his breath coming out white. They're coming. That was the whole sentence. She understood immediately. How many? 6 armed. Your uncle, Ashcroft, and a lawyer from Lander. She nodded. Once. How long? 20 minutes, maybe less. I cut through the north draw. They're on the wagon road. She turned. She went inside. Mordecai looked up when she came through the door, read her face, and stood. Now. He looked at the rifle on the quarter wall. She looked at it too. She said, no guns. He looked at her. Guns give them a story, where I'm a girl who resisted, and they had to use force. I want them to have no story except the true one. Mordecai looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. He left the rifle where it was. He did not touch it. Wren left to warn the ones who might come stand. Adaline changed her boots. She put on her mother's coat. She combed her hair. She braided it once, down her back. She did not shake, not once. She put the folded papers into her inside pocket. She stood at the door. Mordecai stood behind her. Not close, not far. The specific distance of a man who understood. This was not his moment, but he would be behind her, whichever way it went. She opened the door. She stepped out into the sun. They came up the slopey in a wedge. 6 armed men in front, on horseback. Rifles across their laps. Not raised, just present. Behind them, 3 riders. Elias Thorncroft, her uncle. On the sorrel gelding she had fed for 7 years. Beauregard Ashcroft, larger, older, with the specific bearing of a man who had never once in his life been told no, by anyone, and meant it, and a small man with a leather satchel. Wire-rimmed spectacles. The lawyer. They stopped, 40 feet from the door. Nobody dismounted. Elias raised his voice. Adaline. His voice was warm, warmer than it had ever been in 7 years of her sleeping under his roof. Adaline, praise God, you're alive. Adaline stood in the snow. She looked at him. She did not move. He tried again. Come out into the light where I can see you, child. We thought you were dead. We had a service in the church, she said, quietly. Uncle Elias, what are you doing on this hill? He composed his face into an expression of sadness. Come home, Adaline. Come home, and we will speak of it properly. Not out here, in this cold, in front of these men. She did not move. She said, the men are here for a reason. Say the reason out loud, or leave. Beauregard Ashcroft spoke, for the first time. Miss Thorncroft, his voice was smooth, deep, cultivated. Everything in it was designed to be believed. Your uncle received a death certificate 2 weeks ago, filed in good faith by the church at Foxglove Junction, on the basis of the storm. Under the law, this hill and the land on which it sits reverts to his ownership, and through a purchase agreement executed last week. To my ownership, I am here today with counsel to serve the transfer. He paused. Your survival is a joyous thing, truly, but it does not undo the paperwork already filed. That will require its own process in Cheyenne, which we can help you begin after you leave the premises. He said it kindly. He said it like he had said it many times before, to many people, in many valleys, and most of them had believed him. Adaline looked at him. She said, you wrote a death certificate for a girl who was not dead. The church at Foxglove filed it, Miss Thorncroft, not I, because you told them to. Ashcroft smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes. That is a serious accusation, not one you can substantiate. She reached into her coat. She took out the first paper. The deed. She unfolded it very slowly, so they could see her hands. She held it up. This is the deed to 40 acres, in the North Valley, registered in the Wyoming Territory, in October of 1873, in the name of Adaline Rose Thorncroft, minor, held in trust by Elias Thorncroft. She looked at Elias, with a written instruction from my father, that the title transfer into my name, on the day I turned 17. She paused, which was 3 months ago. Elias's face did not change, but his hands on the reins changed. Ashcroft looked at the lawyer. The lawyer nudged his horse forward. 2 steps. May I see the document, miss? She did not move. You may see it. When your employer explains why he is on this hill, that is the hill his hired man Silas Pitt was paid by my uncle to locate and map for him so he could claim it before I was of age, to claim my own inheritance next to it. She reached into her coat again. She took out the second paper. She unfolded it. She held it up beside the deed. This is a signed instruction, in my uncle's handwriting, instructing Silas Pitt to sketch this shelter's approach. For delivery to Ashcroft. Second half of payment on delivery. Signed, E. Thorncroft. The lawyer's face went very still. Adaline lowered her hand. She looked at Elias. On the night you sent me out, Uncle, you paid 3 men, 5 silver, to make sure I did not survive it. I heard them speak. Through the wall of the trapper's shack, where they refused to let me in. She paused. They spoke your name. Elias did not move. He did not deny it, which was its own answer. Ashcroft looked at the lawyer. Mr. Wells, the lawyer said quietly. Mr. Ashcroft, if the deed is authentic, this is a matter for the territorial court. Is it authentic? The lawyer looked at Adaline. May I see the deed, miss? She nodded. He dismounted. He walked forward slowly, hands visible. She let him take it. He read it. He read it again. He turned it over. He examined the seal. He examined the notarization. He looked up at Ashcroft. He said, very quietly, this is authentic. The seal is Nebraska, October 1873. The transfer registration to Wyoming Territory is filed. The father's written instruction for transfer at age 17 is clear on its face. I recognize the notary. He paused. The document is valid, and her majority under the terms of the grant was reached 3 months ago. Ashcroft's face did not change, but the men behind him shifted in their saddles. The way six armed men shift when they realize the story they were told does not match the story they are now inside. And that was when it happened. Ashcroft's eyes moved. Past Adaline, past her, to Mordecai, standing 5 feet behind her, in the doorway of the shelter. She heard the moment Ashcroft saw him, even without looking, because the air in front of her changed. Ashcroft did not speak, but his horse shifted under him, because his hands went slack on the reins. Adaline turned her head slightly, enough to see. Mordecai was standing very still. He was not doing anything. I was not saying anything. He was simply looking at Beauregard Ashcroft. For the first time in 12 years, the look did not have hatred in it. It had something older than hatred. It had memory. It had a woman named Constance, who had died 3 miles from Foxglove Junction in a stand of pine on a November night because there had been nowhere for her to go. Ashcroft looked at Mordecai. For a full 6 seconds, he did not speak. Then he looked away. He looked at the snow. Then he looked at the lawyer, and his voice, when it came, was not smooth anymore. Mr. Wells, we're leaving. The lawyer looked at him. Mr. Ashcroft, the deed. We are leaving. Wells looked at Adaline. He held out the deed to her. He said quietly, Miss Thorncroft, I will file a notice of return in Cheyenne, confirming the parcel is yours per the terms of your father's grant. Do you wish to make additional filing regarding the shelter parcel? She looked at Mordecai. She looked back at Wells. The shelter parcel belongs to Mordecai Vale, who has held and improved it for 12 years. I will petition on his behalf, if needed. Wells nodded. He handed her back the deed. He mounted his horse. The 6 armed men, without a word from anyone, turned their horses and started back down the slope. Ashcroft turned his horse. He rode after them. He did not look at Mordecai again, not once. Elias did not turn. He sat on the sorrel gelding for a long moment in the snow while his employer and the lawyer and the 6 armed men rode away from him down the hill without him. Then he looked at Adaline. His face was arranged into something that was supposed to be sorrow. Adaline, child, come here. She looked at him. She said nothing. Adaline, I am your uncle. I am the only family you have left in this world. Whatever you think I have done, there is no one else, only me. She waited because she wanted him to hear his own words for as long as he was capable of hearing them. Then she said, very quietly, you taught me, uncle. That blood does not mean anything if there is no love in it. She paused. Thank you for that lesson. It has been useful this month. She turned her back. She walked toward the shelter door. She did not look at him again. Behind her, somewhere in the snow, she heard the sorrel gelding turn and walk away. She did not turn. She kept walking, and when she reached the door, Mordecai stepped aside and let her pass, and she went inside, and she sat down on the stool by the stove, and she pressed both hands against her face, and she breathed for a long time. By the following week, the valley knew because Ren Callahan was a man who could ride, and a man who could talk, and a man who had strong opinions about what had happened on that hill. He rode to every farm in Brier Hollow. He rode to Foxglove Junction. He rode to the general store. He told the story once, and then the valley told itself. For weeks, farmers came up the slope, not for shelter, because the storm was over, but to see it, to stand at the door, to shake Mordecai's hand. Some of them brought things. The Boone family sent up a jar of honey. The blacksmith sent 2 new iron bolts for the door. He said, through his son who delivered them, that there would be no charge for the man who kept his neighbors alive. Old Jedediah Marsh, 72 years old, walked up the slope with his cane, alone in late January on a cold day. He stood in the doorway. He looked around. He looked at Mordecai. He looked at Adaline. He said, I heard about this place for years. I always thought it was a story people told. He paused. I was wrong not to believe it. Mordecai made no response that could be recorded. But Adaline, standing at the shelves behind him, saw his shoulders shift in a way she had learned to read. The Jensen boy came up on a Saturday in early February, 13 years old, serious-faced. In the way, some children were quiet when they were paying full attention to everything around them. His name was Thomas Jensen. He had asked Mordecai 2 days before whether he could come up and learn how the stove system worked. He wanted to understand the draw mechanism. Mordecai had told him to come Saturday, then mentioned it to Adaline, with the careful indirection of a man extending an invitation he did not want to seem to be extending. Thought you might want to be there. She was there. The boy arrived at the door with the punctuality of someone who had been thinking about this visit for days. Mordecai showed him the stove's draw mechanism, the relationship between the damper position and the rate of combustion. The boy asked questions that were more precise than Adaline had expected, and Mordecai answered them with the seriousness he brought to any question that deserved it. Adaline sat at the work table and watched the two of them and thought about 12 years of solitude on this hill and a 13-year-old boy standing in this chamber on a Saturday afternoon, asking about draw mechanisms. The distance between those two facts was immeasurable. It was also very short. When the boy left, in the late afternoon, Mordecai stood at the door and watched him go down the slope. Then he turned to Adaline. He said, very quietly, there's a room at the back, past the wood store. I haven't used it for anything. He paused. It needs a cot. There's timber in the storage room, if someone wanted to help with that. It was not the most graceful invitation ever extended. It was, she understood, the most genuine one she had ever received. Not shaped to impress or persuade, just the accurate expression of something a private man had decided to say before he could talk himself out of it. She said, I can cut the pieces myself. Mordecai's jaw moved in a way that on a different face might have been called a smile. I know you can. He kept his eyes on the doorway. That wasn't the point. She wrote a letter to Nebraska, to the notary whose seal was on the deed, requesting a certified copy for her records. The notary wrote back, confirming the document and enclosing an official duplicate with his current seal. She put both copies in the tin box on the shelf near the stove, the one that held Mordecai's important papers. He did not move them, which was its own answer. She helped him build the cot in the back room, then a shelf, then a small table. The room was not large, but it had good bones, and the earth walls held warmth, the way the rest of the shelter held warmth. She moved her canvas bag into it. On a Tuesday in mid-February, she hung her mother's coat on a hook by the door. She set the brass lantern on the small table. She placed her father's folding knife next to it. She sat on the cot for a moment. She thought about her father, pressing the knife into her palm that last summer. She thought about 7 years of belonging to no one. And she thought about this room, which was not much, but which was hers. She lay back on the cot, and she looked at the earth ceiling, and she cried, once, quietly, for maybe 2 minutes. Then she got up, and she went out to the stove, and she made coffee, for herself and for Mordecai, who was working on a repair at the back of the main chamber. He came to the stove when he smelled it. He took his cup. He looked at her briefly. He nodded once. He did not say anything, but he refilled her cup before he refilled his own. which was, in his particular vocabulary, a whole conversation. They drank their coffee, in the quiet of a hill that was not fighting the sky above it. Then came the day, in late February, when she decided. She did not tell anyone. She did not make an occasion of it. She just took her coat and walked down the slope. In the mid-morning light, the walk took 20 minutes. Elias's cabin was intact. Smoke from the chimney. The wood pile lower than it should be at this point in winter, but not critically so. Elias opened the door, before she knocked, which meant he had seen her coming, down the slope. He looked at her the way you look at something you have decided has a fixed shape, and then discovered the shape has changed. She stood on the step below him, in the clear light of a Wyoming February. That made everything sharp and equal. She had thought about what she wanted to say on the walk down, and what she had arrived at was something simple enough that she trusted herself to say it, without preparation. "I wanted you to know I'm not dead," she said. "I'm not coming back." She held his gaze steadily. "I don't need anything from you. I'm not asking you to feel anything in particular about this. I just thought you should know those two things, because they're true and you're the only family I have. And between us, I think true things should be said." Elias looked at her for a long moment. His face moved through something complicated. Then it settled back into the familiar stillness, which she understood by now was not the absence of feeling. It was the refusal to perform it, he said, after a long time. "Where are you?" Not a challenge, something closer to the question underneath the question. "North of here, on Vale's Hill." Elias nodded slowly. He did not ask more than that. She turned. She walked back up the slope. He did not call after her. She had not expected him to. What she had not expected was the specific quality of what she felt on the walk back. Not relief exactly, not triumph. Something more like the feeling of a door closing on its own, without anyone pushing it, because the room on the other side no longer held anything that needed reaching for. 7 years of labor, 7 years of being a resource rather than a person. All of it closed now, not with drama, not with justice in any formal sense, just with the simple finality of a thing that was finished. March came in cold. The snow on the south slopes began to pull back. Toward the tree line, Cinder Creek below the hill began to move under its ice, the sound of it audible on still mornings as a low, purposeful murmur. Adaline was outside, on a Tuesday, behind the shelter, checking the primary vent exit again, because the freeze-thaw cycle of early spring was harder on the pipes than deep winter. She heard Wren coming. He was on horseback this time, not on foot. He came up the slope at a pace that was faster than his usual arriving pace. She stood up from where she was crouched by the vent. She waited. He swung down from the horse before it had fully stopped. He walked toward her. He was holding something in his gloved hand. A letter, sealed with red wax, pressed with a symbol she did not immediately recognize. He held it out to her. Then he said, "Adaline, 3 other letters like it, went to other homesteads in the valley. This week, the same seal." He met her eyes. "It's a railroad company, out of Cheyenne." Adaline held the letter in her hand. She did not open it. Wren said, "They're surveying spur lines through this valley. They want to buy right-of-way on both sides of the road and on ridge parcels, for water access, for steam." He paused. "Beauregard Ashcroft sold his South holdings 2 days ago to their agent." He looked at her. "They know about this hill. They know it has a spring. They know it has drainage, and they know somebody built a system into it that can hold 20 people through a blizzard." He paused again. "They are coming for all of it." Adaline looked at the sky, which was clear, blue, empty of all color that was not blue. She looked at the valley below, where the smoke rose from cabins that had held, where families she had fed were sitting down to eat their afternoon meal. She looked back at Wren. "Come inside." She sat at the work table with the letter in front of her. Mordecai came from the back corridor. He read Wren's face. He sat down. He waited. Adaline opened the letter. She read it once. Slowly, she set it down. She turned it toward Mordecai, and she read the key portions out loud. "Offered to purchase the ridge parcel and adjacent water rights for a sum that was substantial, but not close to what the parcel was worth, to someone who was going to run a railroad through it. Response requested within 60 days. If refused, the company reserved the right to petition for right-of-way easement under territorial statute," which was a polite way of saying, "If you do not sell to us, we will take it anyway, through a court that is friendlier to railroads than to homesteaders." Mordecai read the letter for himself. In full, he set it down. He looked at Adaline. He said, Constance and I bought 40 acres because we thought a piece of ground could belong to a person if the person put in the work. He paused. I built this hill for 12 years on the same idea. He looked at the letter, then at her. I have never been good at fighting men in coats who have signatures for weapons. Adaline looked at the letter. She looked at Mordecai. She looked at Wren, who was still standing, watching them both. She thought about what she had said to Elias on the step of his cabin. True things should be said. She thought about the 20 people who had walked out of this hill on the 8th morning alive. She thought about the smoke rising from the 6 chimneys in the valley below. She said, very quietly, we built this place to keep the cold out. She paused. I think now we may have to keep the whole valley. Mordecai did not answer immediately. He looked at the table. Then he looked at her. He said, then that's the next thing. Wren cleared his throat. He said, there are people down there who owe you both more than they can pay in one lifetime. They will stand if they are asked, but they need to be asked because they do not know yet. That standing is what is being asked of them. Adaline looked at him. She said, then ride, talk to the Boones in the marshes, and Coulter tonight before it gets dark. Wren nodded. He turned toward the door. He paused, with his hand on the frame. What do I tell them? Adaline stood up from the work table. She walked to the door with him. She looked out at the valley, where the low afternoon sun was catching the ridges and turning the snow the color of new bread. She said, tell them the shelter door is open. Tell them we will meet here, Sunday afternoon, anyone who wants to keep their land. Wren nodded. He mounted his horse. He rode down the slope, his silhouette against the low sun, dark and moving, toward the smoke of the valley. Adaline stood at the door of the shelter. The letter in her hand, Mordecai stood beside her. The wind was soft. The snow on the south slopes was pulling back, toward the tree line, faster now, every day. Spring was coming, and with it, something else, something bigger than one girl and one uncle, and one blizzard and one hill, something that was going to require everything this valley had. Adaline looked down at her hands. They were not shaking. They were steady, the way her father's hands had been steady when he pressed the folding knife into her palm. A knife is not a weapon, Ada. It is a tool, she thought, very quietly, and every person ought to have one good one. She looked at Mordecai. He was looking at her, he said, without any weight in his voice. You know what this means, she said. I know, he said. There will be men in courtrooms, and men on horseback, and men who write for newspapers, and most of them will not be on our side, she said. I know that too. He looked at the valley, then he looked back at her. He said, very quietly, good. That was all he said. But that word was the biggest word he had said to her in 3 months of standing beside her. She stepped back through the door, into the warmth of the hill, into the amber light of the lanterns, into the space that had held 20 souls through 8 days of storm, the place that had, without anyone's permission, except the permission of showing up and doing the work, until the work made its own meaning, become a home. She set the letter on the work table. She weighed it down with the tin coffee cup so it would not blow when she opened the door on Sunday. For however many people came, she went to the shelves. She began pulling down what she would need to feed a room full of neighbors. On Sunday afternoon, Mordecai went to the corridor to bring up more chairs from the second storage room. Wren was somewhere on the wagon road, riding toward the Boones, and outside, over the ridges, the sky was turning that particular blue, that only Wyoming skies turn, in the last hour before evening, the blue of a country that had not yet been decided by anyone, for anyone. The winter had ended. Something else was beginning. And Adaline Thorncroft, 17 years old, standing at the shelves of a hill that had once, on a night the sky went the color of a bruised peach, been the only place on earth that had not turned her away, was ready for whatever came next, because the fire in this hill would not go out, not this spring, not any spring, not while she was standing in it.